The server room was a canyon of cooling fans and blinking status lights. Doctor. Aris stood before the main rack, his breath visible in the chilled air. He tapped his tablet, routing the final cluster allocation for his frontier model. The screen hung for a heartbeat. Then, the text turned crimson. Resource unavailable. Priority assigned to cloud API traffic. Aris stared at the red glow. He tapped the command again, forcing a refresh. The message did not change. It sat there, a digital dead end. He looked up at the towering monolith of hardware, listening to the sluggish, rhythmic pulse of the processors. They were processing ad revenue, not the research that defined the future of the field. He tucked the tablet under his arm and turned away. The silence of the room was absolute, save for the constant mechanical hum of machines he could no longer touch. He walked toward the heavy steel door, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. The system had made its choice. He was no longer the priority. Aris pushed through the heavy exit door and stepped into the sterile white glare of the hallway. The air here was warmer, smelling of filtered ventilation and stale coffee. He slowed his pace. 20 feet ahead, Sarah stood by the elevator bank. She held a thick, cream-colored envelope, the edges crisp and sharp. Her hand gripped it with enough pressure to whiten her knuckles. She did not look at the call button. She looked at the floor, then up, catching his eyes as he approached. Aris stopped. He saw the letter. He saw the way she held her breath, waiting for a challenge that never came. There was no need for explanations. The empty cluster requests, the throttled experiments, the constant reprioritization for commercial traffic, it was all written in the way she stood, detached from the building around her. He gave a single, slow nod. Sarah returned it. The elevator chime broke the tension, a sharp, metallic sound. She stepped inside, the doors sliding shut to seal her departure. Aris stood alone in the corridor. The wall of corporate policy had become absolute. He turned toward the exit, his decision finalized by the emptiness of the hall. The downtown office lacked the hum of a data center. It was silent, save for the low drone of city traffic 20 stories below. Aris sat at a glass table, his palms flat against the cold surface. 3 men watched him. They did not move. They waited for a pitch that relied on market share, but Aris delivered a reality check instead. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his case and slid it across the glass. The graph showed 2 lines. One was the steady, flat trajectory of commercial product scaling. The other was the jagged, plummeting curve of internal research capability. The gap between them was widening every quarter. Aris tapped the paper. "We are building a dedicated lab," he said. "No product managers, no cloud billing queues, just raw compute." The men looked at the graph, then at Aris. They saw the technical debt of the giants. They saw the stagnation caused by prioritizing ad revenue over the frontier. The air in the room tightened. One of the investors reached for a fountain pen. He did not ask about quarterly projections or user acquisition. He only looked at the compute metrics. The logic was undeniable. Aris watched them assess the scale of the failure he had escaped. The decision was already made in their silence. The fountain pen hit the paper with a distinct, sharp scratch. It was the only sound in the room. The investor pushed the term sheet back toward Aris, his expression unreadable, his movements deliberate. There were no handshakes, no optimistic projections, no rehearsed corporate platitudes about future synergy, just the weight of the document and the sudden, irreversible finality of the ink on the page. Aris took the folder. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo with the suddenness of their departure from the old order. The power dynamic had shifted in the span of a single minute. The giants in the valley were still operating under the assumption that they controlled the bottleneck, but the bottleneck had just been bypassed. Eris walked to the window. Below, the city grid stretched out, indifferent to the structural change occurring in this office. He looked at the folder. It was not just a contract. It was a mandate for total hardware sovereignty. The era of the hyperscaler monopoly on intelligence had begun its countdown. He turned away from the glass, stepped toward the door, and exited the room. Recursive was no longer a theory. It was an entity, and it was ready to claim its own future. The news did not travel through official channels. It moved in hushed conversations, in break rooms, and encrypted messages sent late at night. In the sprawling corridors of Mountain View, the air grew thin. Researchers looked at their dashboards, then at the stalled queues, and finally at their badges. The choice was binary. Stay for the stock options and the comfort of a slow, managed decline, or leave for a warehouse with no guarantees. By Monday, the exodus began. It was not a grand exit with speeches. It was the sound of personal boxes sliding off desks and the click of keycards being dropped into security bins. One by one, the lead engineers walked out of the glass-walled labs. They left behind the ergonomic chairs and the endless cafeteria lines. They left the performance reviews that measured impact by lines of code rather than breakthrough potential. Every departure was a quiet severance of the tether to the hyperscaler. They walked toward their cars with nothing but their expertise and the shared knowledge that the real work was moving elsewhere. The campus did not stop, but it hollowed out. The talent was migrating, and they were not looking back at the monolith they had helped build. They were heading toward the promise of hardware sovereignty. The warehouse was a cavern of echoes until the trucks arrived. It smelled of cold concrete and industrial dust. The team moved with a frantic, focused energy, dragging heavy wooden crates across the floor. They pried the lids off with iron bars, revealing rows of H100s packed in protective foam. Each processor was a promise. They carried the units to the racks, their movements synchronized by a shared, silent urgency. Cables began to snake across the floor like black veins, coiling around the base of the metal frames. They stripped back insulation and tightened terminals, the sharp scent of ozone beginning to cut through the stagnant air. Every connection was a step away from the managed queues they had left behind. They worked in the dim light, the only illumination coming from the occasional flicker of a stray overhead lamp. There was no corporate oversight here, no bureaucracy to sign off on the layout, just the raw, physical accumulation of compute. They connected the final power leads, the heavy cables humming with latent current. The room felt pressurized, the air thick with the electric tension of a machine waiting to be woken. They stood back, hands covered in dust, staring at the dense, silent structure they had built. The threshold was crossed. The hardware was ready. Dr. Aris reached for the main distribution breaker. His hand hovered for a second. Then he pushed the lever home. The sound was a heavy, metallic thud that echoed through the entire warehouse. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The darkness held firm. Then the surge hit the grid. The lights above the racks flickered violently, struggling to compensate for the massive, sudden draw. Cables vibrated against the concrete floor, emitting a low-frequency buzz that could be felt in the chest. Then, the indicator lights ignited. First one, then hundreds, blooming in rapid, cascading rows of blue and white. The cooling fans roared to life. A sudden piercing whine that climbed in pitch until it settled into a steady, industrial drone. The warehouse was no longer a tomb of echoes. It was a furnace of compute. The monitors mounted on the walls snapped on, flooding the dark corners with the glow of live training telemetry. The raw potential of the hardware was finally unthrottled, drawing power directly from the city grid without a single corporate filter to dampen the output. The air grew warm, charged with a scent of ozone and high-performance silicon. They stood in the center of the light, watching the data streams begin to crawl across the screens. The machine was awake. The interface blinked, waiting for input. On the terminal, a list of previously rejected training protocols sat ready. These were the experiments labeled as non-essential, the ones that had been buried under layers of corporate review and resource denial. Dr. Aris moved the cursor to the top of the list and selected the most intensive model architecture. A prompt appeared, warning of extreme compute demand, but there were no product managers here to click deny. He hit enter. The command bypassed every ghost of the old infrastructure. On the screens, the telemetry began to shift. The model parameters didn't just crawl, they leaped. Graphs that had been flat for years suddenly spiked, showing the system consuming every cycle the warehouse could provide. There were no throttles, no artificial latency, and no background processes competing for bandwidth. The team watched the loss function begin a steady, aggressive decline. They had spent years asking for permission to run these calculations, only to be met with bureaucracy. Now, they were simply doing the work. The code executed with a raw, brutal efficiency. Each iteration pushed the system into territory that had been off-limits at their former employer. They were no longer researchers waiting for a slot in the queue. They were architects of their own progress, reclaiming the scientific autonomy that had been denied to them for far too long. The parameter count climbed past the 1 trillion mark, a threshold that had been a theoretical ceiling in their old lab. Dr. Aris watched the screen as the loss function, once stubborn and stagnant, began to plummet. It moved with a velocity that defied the established benchmarks of the industry. He tapped a key, pulling up the raw error logs to check for a hardware fault or a logic error. There was none. The system was simply learning. Sarah walked over, her eyes fixed on the descending curve of the graph. She leaned in, checking the timestamps of the training iterations. The drop was real. It was consistent. It was accelerating. They had traded corporate oversight for silicon sovereignty, and the result was an immediate, quantifiable leap in performance. The warehouse grew silent, save for the hum of the cooling racks. As the team stood shoulder to shoulder, they watched the numbers tumble. Every integer that fell represented a breakthrough that their former employer had dismissed as impossible. The gap between the legacy giants and this converted warehouse was closing by the second. They were no longer just running experiments. They were witnessing the collapse of the established compute order. The telemetry continued to update. A relentless stream of progress that proved their independence was not just a choice, but a superior strategy. The final training cycle finished, leaving the screen glowing with the proof of their success. Dr. Aris reached over to the main console and executed the final command to revoke all external administrative access. The last tether to the corporate network vanished, leaving them in complete, self-governed isolation. There were no more requests for compute, no more queue management, and no more artificial restrictions on the scale of their inquiry. The cooling fans in the warehouse cycled up to a steady, rhythmic roar, a sound that now represented total technical sovereignty. The researchers stood back, watching the steady hum of machines that answered only to them. They had successfully built an independent forge. A space where the pursuit of intelligence was no longer dictated by quarterly budgets or product roadmaps. The era of the hyperscaler monopoly had come to a definitive end. They were no longer subjects of a tech giant. They were the owners of the most advanced computational power in the world. As the lights in the warehouse flickered in harmony with the processor load, the path forward was clear. The machines were theirs. The research was theirs. And for the first time in history, the future of intelligence would be written without permission.